Hello everyone, and welcome back to Talk Helen. I'm Helen, and I'm really excited about today's episode because we're talking about one of the most misunderstood topics in English learning. Joining me today is Ethan. Ethan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Helen. Always great to be here. And honestly, I think today's topic is something almost every English learner has searched online at least once.
I completely agree, because today's topic is the secret to sounding more American in English. Now, before we start, I want to make something very clear. Sounding more American does not mean changing who you are. It does not mean pretending to be someone else. And it definitely does not mean losing your own identity. What we're really talking about today is understanding how Americans naturally communicate. Most people think sounding American is about accent, but that's only a small part of the story.
Really? I think most learners assume accent is everything.
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest mistakes. Imagine two English learners. The first learner has an excellent American accent, but they use awkward textbook sentences. The second learner has a noticeable foreign accent, but they use natural American expressions. Guess who usually sounds more American?
The second person.
Exactly, because communication is much bigger than pronunciation. It's about rhythm, word choice, conversation habits, energy, reactions, and everyday expressions. That's what we're going to explore today. Now, let me ask you something. Imagine somebody asks, "How are you?" What do many learners say?
I'm fine, thank you. And you?
Exactly. Perfectly correct, but not very American. Most Americans are more likely to say, "Pretty good," "Doing great," "Not bad," "Can't complain," "Doing all right." Those responses immediately sound more natural. And that's our first lesson. The secret isn't bigger vocabulary. The secret is using the vocabulary Americans actually use. Now here's another example. Imagine somebody thanks you. Many learners automatically say, "You're welcome." Nothing wrong with that. But Americans often say, "No problem, of course, sure, anytime, you got it." Those responses feel more relaxed, more conversational, more American. American English tends to be relaxed, comfortable, efficient.
That's true. Americans seem to shorten everything.
Exactly. And that's our second lesson. Americans love shortening language. For example, they don't always say, "I am going to." They often say, "I'm gonna." Not because they don't know proper grammar, but because that's how people naturally speak. Now imagine somebody says, "What do you want to do?" Americans often say, "Wanna grab coffee?" Not. "Would you like to consume coffee together?"
Hopefully nobody says that.
Exactly. And that's the point. Natural American English values simplicity, not complexity. Now, here's another secret. Americans use reactions constantly. Imagine somebody tells you, "I just got promoted." A textbook learner might say, "Congratulations." An American speaker might say, "No way. That's awesome. That's amazing. Good for you." Notice the difference? More energy, more emotion, more reaction. And that's one reason Americans often sound expressive. They react to what people say. They don't just listen, they participate. Now let's imagine another situation. A friend tells you, "I bought my first house." An American might immediately respond, That's incredible. That's awesome. That's huge. These reactions appear constantly in American conversations. And if you start using them naturally, your English instantly sounds more American. Now here's another thing. Americans love small talk.
That's definitely true.
And many learners underestimate how important that is. Imagine entering an elevator. An American might say, "How's your day going?" Or, "Crazy weather today." Or, "Busy morning?" These aren't deep conversations. They're connection starters. And Americans use them all the time. Now let's talk about another habit. Americans often use people's names. Imagine somebody says, "Thanks for your help." An American might say, "No problem, Ethan." Notice how personal that feels? Using names creates warmth, connection, friendliness. And it's very common. Now here's another thing learners often miss. Americans don't always answer questions directly. For example, question, "Do you want pizza?" Textbook answer, "Yes." American answer, "Sure. Sounds good." Why not? "I'm down." Those responses feel more conversational, and you'll hear them everywhere. Now let's imagine another situation. Somebody asks, "How was the movie?" A learner might say, "It was good." An American might say, "It was pretty good." "It wasn't bad." "It was actually really good." "It was awesome." Again, more conversational, more expressive, more natural. Now here's another major secret. Americans often speak in chunks, not complete textbook sentences. Imagine somebody asks, "Ready?" Americans often say, "Yep," instead of, "Yes, I am ready." Imagine somebody asks, "Need help?" Response, "I'm good." Not, "No, thank you, I do not require assistance." That's real American English. Fast, efficient, natural. And that's something learners should pay attention to, because sounding American often means sounding comfortable, not formal. Now here's another thing. Americans use phrasal verbs constantly. For example, hang out, figure out, find out, pick up, drop off, work out. And honestly, this is one of the biggest differences between textbook English and real American English. Americans love phrasal verbs. They use them everywhere, every day, in almost every conversation. Now, let me ask you something, Ethan. Why do you think learners struggle with sounding American?
Probably because they focus too much on grammar and not enough on real conversations.
Exactly. That's a huge reason. Many learners study English, but they don't study American-speaking English. And there's a difference, because real conversations have rhythm, patterns, habits, expression, and that's where naturalness comes from. Not from grammar books, but from exposure. Now let's imagine two people. One knows every grammar rule. The other watches American interviews, podcasts, YouTube videos, and conversations every day. Who will sound more American?
Usually the second person.
Because they've absorbed the rhythm, the reactions, the expressions, the culture of conversation. And honestly, that's the biggest secret of all. Sounding American isn't something you memorize. It's something you absorb through listening, through noticing, through repetition. Now, here's a challenge for everyone listening. For the next week, pay attention to how Americans actually speak. Listen to podcasts, watch interviews, watch YouTube conversations, and don't focus on grammar. Focus on patterns. Notice how often they say, pretty good, sounds good, no worries, awesome, I'm down, let's do it, because those little phrases are everywhere. And those little phrases are exactly what make English sound natural. Now, before we finish today's conversation, I want everyone listening to remember something important. You don't need a perfect American accent to sound more American. You don't need to change your identity. You don't need to sound like a movie star. What matters is learning how Americans naturally communicate, their rhythm, their expressions, their reactions, their conversation habits, because that's where real naturalness comes from. And honestly, that's something every learner can improve, starting today.
I think that's a really encouraging message, because it means sounding more natural is achievable.
Exactly. It's not magic. It's not talent. It's observation, practice, and consistency. And we're only getting started, because there are even more habits, expressions, and conversation patterns that instantly make English sound more American. And that's exactly what we're going to continue exploring. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because most English learners eventually discover something frustrating. They spend years studying English. They memorize vocabulary. They learn grammar. They practice pronunciation. And yet, when they hear Americans talking to each other, it still sounds different, very different. And they wonder, what am I missing?
I think almost every learner asks that question at some point.
Absolutely. And here's the answer. What's missing is usually not grammar, it's conversation habits. Because Americans don't just speak English, they speak English in a particular way. They have certain patterns, certain reactions, certain rhythms. And once you start noticing those patterns, everything changes. Now, let me ask you something. Imagine an American walks into work. Do they usually say, "Good morning, I hope you are having a pleasant day"?
Not usually.
Exactly. They might simply say, "Hey, morning, what's up? How's it going?" Notice how relaxed that feels. And that's one of the biggest characteristics of American English, relaxation. Americans generally prefer language that feels comfortable. Not formal, not complicated, comfortable. Now here's another thing Americans do constantly. They soften statements. Imagine somebody asks, "Did you like the restaurant?" A learner might say, "Yes, it was good." An American might say, "Yeah, it was pretty good." Or, "It was actually really good." Or, "It was kinda nice." Notice all those little words. Pretty, actually, really, kinda. Americans use those constantly, and they make speech sound more natural. Now, here's another secret. Americans love the word actually.
That's true. I hear it everywhere.
Everywhere. Imagine somebody says, "You've never been to Chicago, right?" You reply, "Actually, I have." Or, "Actually, I lived there for a year." It's one of the most common conversation words in American English. Now let's talk about another habit. Americans rarely sound 100% certain. They often soften opinions. For example, "I think," I guess, probably, maybe, honestly, to be honest. These phrases appear constantly. Imagine somebody asks, "What's the best city to live in?" Many learners feel pressure to give a perfect answer. Americans often say, "I think it depends," or "I'd probably say Seattle." Notice how flexible that sounds, and that's very American. Now here's something else. Americans often use filler phrases, not because they don't know what to say, but because that's how conversations naturally flow. For example, you know, like, I mean, so...
People use those constantly.
Exactly. And learners sometimes try to eliminate them completely. But native speakers use them every day. Imagine somebody says, "It was really stressful, you know," or, "It wasn't terrible," or, "So what happened next?" These little phrases make speech sound natural. Now here's another thing Americans do. They tell stories differently. Instead of simply sharing facts, they make conversations feel alive. Imagine somebody asks, "How was your weekend?" A learner might say, "It was good." An American might say, "It was pretty good. I went hiking and somehow got completely lost." Immediately more interesting, more conversational, more engaging, because Americans often add small stories, small details, small moments, and those details create connection. Now, let's talk about reactions, because reactions are one of the biggest secrets to sounding American. Imagine somebody tells you, "I just got engaged." A learner might say, "Congratulations," which is great, but an American might also say, "No way, that's amazing, that's awesome, that's huge." Notice the energy? Americans often react emotionally, and those reactions create excitement in conversations. Now, imagine somebody tells you, "My flight got cancelled." An American might say, "That sucks," or "Oh man," or "That's rough." Again, real reactions, not textbook reactions, and that's why they sound natural. Now, here's another important thing. Americans love casual agreement phrases. Instead of always saying yes, they say definitely, for sure, absolutely, totally, exactly. Those phrases appear constantly in American conversations. And once you start using them naturally, your English starts sounding much more American. Now, let's imagine another situation. A friend suggests getting coffee. Instead of saying, "Yes, I would like that," an American might say, "Sounds good. I'm down. Let's do it." Sure, again, short, simple, natural. That's the pattern you'll see again and again. Now, here's something learners often don't realize. Americans ask lots of questions, not because they're curious about everything, but because questions keep conversations moving. Imagine somebody says, "I went to New York last weekend." A learner might respond, "Nice. Conversation over." An American might respond, "Oh yeah, how was it?" Or, "What was your favorite part?" Or, "Have you been there before?" That's why American conversations often feel energetic. People keep the conversation alive. Now let's talk about another huge difference. Americans often sound enthusiastic, even in ordinary situations. Imagine somebody asks, "How was dinner?" Instead of, "It was good," you might hear, "It was great," "It was awesome," "It was fantastic," "It was really good." Sometimes learners think Americans exaggerate, and honestly, they do, a little. But it's part of the communication style. It's part of the energy. And that's why American conversations often sound positive and expressive. Now, here's another secret. Americans often focus on connection more than correctness. Imagine somebody makes a small grammar mistake. Most Americans don't care. What they care about is the conversation, the connection, the interaction. And that's important for learners to understand, because many learners are afraid of speaking until their English becomes perfect. But Americans usually value participation more than perfection. Now, let me ask you something, Ethan. If somebody wanted to sound more American immediately, what's the first thing you'd recommend?
Probably listening to real Americans more often.
Exactly. Because exposure changes everything. The more American English you hear, the more natural patterns you absorb, not just vocabulary, but rhythm, tone, reactions, timing, conversation habits, all the little things that textbooks can't fully teach. Now, here's a challenge for everyone listening. For the next week, pay attention to these phrases. Pretty good. Sounds good. For sure. Actually. You know. I mean. Totally. Awesome. Listen for them. Count how often you hear them. You'll be shocked because they're everywhere, and once you start using them naturally, your English begins to shift. Little by little, conversation by conversation. Now, before we finish today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. The secret to sounding more American isn't copying an accent. It's understanding communication style. It's learning how Americans greet people, how they react, how they tell stories, how they express opinions, how they keep conversations moving, because that's what people notice most, not whether every sound is perfect, but whether the conversation feels natural. And the wonderful thing is that something anyone can learn, one phrase at a time, one conversation at a time, one day at a time.
I think that's one of the most encouraging things about language learning. You don't need to become someone else. You just need to understand how people communicate.
Exactly. And once you understand that, everything gets easier. Your conversations feel smoother, your confidence grows, and your English starts sounding much more natural. Ethan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Helen. This was one of my favorite topics.
Mine too. And thank you to everyone listening. Remember, sounding more American isn't about perfection. It's about patterns. Listen carefully. Notice what native speakers do. Use those habits naturally, and you'll be amazed how quickly your English transforms. I'll see you in the next episode of Talk Helen. Take care, everyone.